Hi, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Isabella Perry and I'm going to be your moderator. This presentation is on strengthening food safety through effective root cause analysis and corrective action with PJRFSI, presented by Lauren Maloney, Food Safety Accreditation Manager for PJRFSI. So some quick housekeeping before we start today's presentation. There will be a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions throughout our presentation for our presenter, please use the Q&A portion at the top of the Teams control panel with anything that you might kind of think of. The slides and the recording will be available on our website after today's presentation. So keep an eye out for that. Any additional questions, you can contact us through our website for more info. So check out our YouTube and our webinar page for today's presentation. Hopefully by the end of today, if not tomorrow, check in. Now Lauren will take it away discussing today's topic.
Great, thank you, Bella, for that introduction. Happy to be here to discuss the important area of root cause and corrective action in food safety certification systems. So Isabella went through the housekeeping already, and we'll just get started. So today, during our agenda, we're going to look at the corrective action process, a statement of nonconformity, actions to correct, root cause, corrective actions, verification activities, and then a few case studies. So let's look at the corrective action process. The corrective action process, it really feeds into each other. It's a system of having a set of requirements, identifying a problem or a nonconformance against one of those requirements, and then putting into the correction, root cause, and corrective and preventive action to solve that problem and keep that problem from occurring again. So what is a requirement? A requirement is stated from a standard that is identified during an audit. It would include a reference number and a section to a specific set of guidelines. You can get that from the specific standard that you're being audited to. Could be an internal audit or a certification body audit. When the auditor writes references that standard, then they would want to make sure that they reference the exact number and section so that it can be used as a reference in the corrective action process. And then a nonconformity or a problem is identified. So this needs to include a description of the incident. So what exactly occurred and full details about it. So for example, you might see a nonconformity written as loading door number 3, located next to raw material storage area, was found to have a 3-inch gap across the bottom of the door. It could be something like CCP metal detection monitoring frequency was not being met on line 4. Defined frequency is every 30 minutes. CCP records from January 16, 2026 showed only hourly monitoring. So those are pretty robust descriptions of the nonconformity. They tell you what was identified, where it was identified, and refers to specific objective evidence that was seen. Those statements of nonconformities should stand the test over time so that when you go back to those in 10, 20 days, you can easily understand what that nonconformity was and be able to identify what the problem was. If an auditor writes there was a gap in the door, which door? How large of a gap? When was that identified? Could make a difference on what corrective action you're putting in place. And as well as CCP monitoring was not at the correct frequency. Well, what records were identified from when, what was seen, and why that was not meeting the requirement. So those nonconformities should be written robustly and be able to be understood over time to look at them in the future, especially for trending and verification. Okay, so the first step in the process after identifying the nonconformity is the action taken to correct. This is also called a correction or containment action. This is something that can be taken right away to stop that problem. So they're incident specifics to fix that one identified problem in the nonconformity. They're very important. They should be taken immediately. They usually can be taken immediately in order to stop that identified problem right then. So they're very specific. So for our first example about identifying the gap in the door, the correction would be we fix the gap. So that's great. Now the pests can't get in. Now there's no issues with possible containment through that door or site security. That problem, that nonconformity, that's an immediate fix that stops that one issue. The same thing is we trained the CCP operator and conducted monitoring every 30 minutes. Okay, the procedure was they have to do the monitoring every 30 minutes. Let's get that back into compliance for that specific identified problem. Okay, but the correction is not where it needs to stop. The process needs to go further in order to make sure that that problem doesn't reoccur, because closing the door does fix it then, but it might not fix it for the future. So the first thing that needs to be done is an action to an extent analysis. So an extent analysis is to look at where else these similar problems may occur. So an auditor may have identified one door during the audit that had a gap, but is there other doors that they did not see or aren't functioning that may have a gap, or their windows, or there are other areas where that similar problem in the facility may occur that weren't just seen during the audit. How deep and how widespread is the problem? So is that CCP monitoring only one operator for one shift? Is it happening on every shift? Is it happening for every CCP? How large is this issue? Without identifying, how far you need to go, you're not going to get at the proper root cause and corrective action. So, like I said, for that extent analysis, some other examples are that the auditor identified a pesticide record without the operator's initials. Maybe they just looked at a few different pages, but is that never being filled out? Is it only not being filled out by one operator? Other operators are initialing. That you found one document that was uncontrolled during the audit. Maybe there's multiple documents that are using the wrong, forms that are being used that are the wrong version. And you found an employee that during the audit that did not attend the annual training. Was that just one employee, or were there multiple employees? Maybe they're new employees that aren't getting the training when they're onboarding. Maybe there's some that are missing the day of the training and you're not going back. So you kind of need to identify what that extent is. So if you dig deeper and how widespread, that'll allow you to determine the actual root cause or help determine. Okay, root cause analysis. So lots of times auditors see clients restating the problem for their root cause. So the auditor identifies that the CCP operator forgot to check the verification every 30 minutes. And then the root cause that's returned is we forgot to check. Well, we know you forgot to check. It was already part of the nonconformity that was written. So you don't want to just restate exactly what was given to you. The root cause is digging in and figuring out why the problem occurred. And it could take multiple steps to figure out that problem, but it would not be the same thing as what was written in the nonconformity. Some CARs give containment answers for the root cause. You also don't want to say, well, we just fixed the door as your root cause. That is a correction. The root cause is a thinking about why that problem occurred, not what you did to fix it. So that needs to be investigated. So what does make a good root cause? What in the system failed such that the problem occurred? The focus should be on the system and not that exact incident, the exact person. It's not a person's fault. It's not an incident that's isolated. It's part of a larger system that is implemented that has a problem that needs to be fixed. So first, we need to investigate what in the system failed such that the problem occurred. When looking into these reasons, you may find that there are multiple root causes of why it occurred. Some problems have several possible ones. And if you can't figure out which one is the correct one, then you might need to do multiple corrective actions to close multiple root causes. So once that root cause is found and it is the correct one, then that problem is turned off, right? So the system identifies that problem and the root cause then can be turned on and the problem stops if it's the correct one. If that root cause was not identified, then it would be an off switch and those problems will probably continue to reoccur. Or it wasn't the correct one. Okay, so how do you get to the correct root cause? There's actually quite a few different techniques for root cause analysis. There's the is not, the fishbone diagram, and the 5 whys or the whys technique. 5 whys is a guidance. Sometimes you can get to the root cause with 3 whys. Sometimes you need more than 5. And it would take 6 whys. It all just depends on that specific root cause. And we're going to use the 5 why or the why technique as an example today. Okay, so let's look at the 5 why technique for the first nonconformity that we identified. Loading door number 3, located next to raw material storage area, was found with a 3-inch gap across the bottom of the door. First why. Why was there a gap? Because maintenance didn't check the doors. Okay. Second why. Why didn't maintenance not check the doors? Nobody told maintenance to check the doors for a gap. Why were maintenance not told? Or what tool did maintenance not have to check those doors? The overhead doors were not listed on the GMP inspection checklist. So the root cause would be that the maintenance was overlooking checking for gaps in the door because it was not listed on their monthly GMP inspection checklist to ensure that they checked for that specific issue. So the corrective action that they would come to would be that GMP inspection checklist was revised to include monthly checks of overhead doors that assigned the issue to a specific job and had verification of the checklist to be filled out monthly that those doors would be checked. So pesticide application record from 4.1 did not include all required information and was missing operator name, weather conditions, active ingredient, and pre-harvest interval PHI. So first why is why weren't the forms completed? Well, the pesticide applicator didn't fill them out. Okay. But that's not the real root cause of why they didn't fill them out. So why didn't they why didn't they fill them out? The second why would be no space on the form to include all required items. So if there was no space for the operator to put them in, then they wouldn't fill it out correctly. And then third why is the pesticide application template did not match the global gap requirements. So the corrective action is determined that the pesticide applicator template was updated and applicators were retrained on all required information. Okay, now, last example of a 5Y is CCP metal detection monitoring frequency was not being met on line 4. Defined frequency is every 30 minutes. CCP records from 1/16/25 showed only hourly monitoring. So the first why would be, why wasn't it being monitored every 30 minutes? The operator didn't know. The second why would be lack of training. A lot of companies would stop there and just retrain their operator and call it a day, but that is not the true root cause. Training typically isn't the reason, not lack of knowledge or lack of training isn't typically the reason why a nonconformity is occurring. It's usually in the system that something doesn't give support to that process in order to make it effective. So we go to the third why. There was no training matrix for the CCP operator assigned. So how do we know that the operator is getting the correct training and that there's a verification that they understand the training that is, or the information that is required of them? So the fifth why would be there was no SOP requiring supervisors to sign off on the training matrix before operator is assigned to the CCP monitoring. So there is verification activities there by someone who knows the process and signing them off before they can undertake that job on their own. So corrective action would be training matrix was implemented and reviewed by supervisors. The SOP was updated to include the requirement. Okay, so what are not acceptable root causes? Things like it was an oversight, we misunderstood the requirement, I forgot, our consultant messed up, a human error, and we didn't know. So there's a lot of reasons beside we didn't know or we forgot. What in the system made that person forget, made that job miss that requirement? Is it that during the internal audit, it wasn't reviewed? Did the person creating the program not look at the requirements and not go over it during the review? Was it just a failure in the system to have that in place? So it definitely needs to be dug deeper. Okay, so corrective actions, they should address the root cause. And again, answer that what in the system failed such that the problem occurred. If you give, like I said, if you give that containment action or corrections instead of corrective action, oh, my corrective action is I trained someone, I filled out the pesticide applicator records, I fixed the gap in the door, those are not acceptable corrective actions. They should address the system and be irreversible, which means that the problem doesn't reoccur. So if that corrective actions were implemented and they were the correct, identified correctly from the root cause, then those problems should not reoccur or problems like them. And you should at least have one corrective action for each root cause that was identified. And in future, it should show that those problems don't reoccur and it prevents the reoccurrence, which we would see in the next audit or in the next internal audit and so on. Now, one thing to remember is that different food safety standards have different timelines to close. It's very important that all of the corrective action, correction, root cause, corrective action implementation is done by the due date, or a client is may get their certificate suspended, or if for initial certification, they would not be certified. So the timelines are very important. SQF has 30 days, BRC has 28, Global Gap has 28 for recertification. Our cannabis and hemp standard has 30 days. And a lot of our other unaccredited is 30 days. So that means that the auditor must accept by that day. And we instruct our auditors to tell the clients maybe 5 to 7 days prior to the deadline that they want to see the correction, root cause, and corrective actions to them. So they have a chance to give feedback, reject, and ask for more information if it isn't correct, so that the nonconformity can be closed by that due date. Sometimes a extension is may be requested, but that's in a very rare situations where capital improvement might be required, like contracting a company to come and fix the floors. Usually you can close a nonconformity with a PO or a contract approval, and then request an extension through the office. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is preventative action. So it is looking at what other systems exist that might have the same root cause present, and what system could I have put in place to prevent this from happening. So just because a nonconformity is identified in one area, like the gap in the door, perhaps the preventive action would be to review the preventive maintenance checklist to see that other areas of the facility aren't being missed, like windows or cleaning in certain areas that are missing from that checklist. So it's going beyond what was identified by taking that problem and seeing if any other area has a similar problem that preventative action could be put into place. A lot of times they put corrective actions for preventative actions. So that's not just about the nonconformity identified. It's addressing areas that could have problems in the future that weren't originally identified during an audit or that specific nonconformity. And again, preventive actions address the system, changing the system in place before problems happen. So verification is not typically something that is submitted during an audit to close a nonconformity. That is something that should be done after the nonconformity is approved by the auditor or certification body. But it's a critical step in that process. It's verifying that the corrective action that you put into place is appropriate and has stopped that problem from occurring. So if you created a new template for your pesticide applicator records and you instructed the operators to fill them out, then maybe going back a month later and checking the templates to make sure that they have been filled out correctly. If they have not, then you would have to then go back to the root cause and see, okay, they have a template now, but why aren't they filling it out correctly? Is it that they don't have that information with them when they're doing it and they need to go back and they forget? Or do they need do they need to have it on a tablet so that they can do it right there in the field, or whatever the issue may be? And like I said, so the following should be verified: those that the correction is made, that root cause has been turned off, and systemic corrective actions have been implemented, and that they're appropriate. You don't want to wait until the next year's audit to get the same nonconformity, as for many food safety standards, this would elevate a minor occurrence to a major occurrence. So we understand that corrective actions can be hard to be implemented. Changing the system, the way people do things, are creatures of habit, and we want to keep doing things the easy way and we want to, and to change that makes it difficult. But with those corrective actions correctly implemented, they would be irreversible. Now, if you verify that they're not working because people are unwilling to change, then there needs to be additional steps taken to make sure that problem doesn't reoccur. And even if you get a positive result on the first time, let's say in the beginning that those operators fill out the templates correctly, and that's the slow season. So then you get to the busy season, and there's more records and they're too busy and they forget, and then they just don't use them anymore. Maybe they're not given the papers, not enough papers were printed for that day or something like that. So you need to continue to verify to make sure that it is implemented correctly. So I have a couple of case studies about what a proper nonconformity, root cause, and corrective actions would look like. So one would be if the nonconformity was written, the internal audit against the food safety code was not fully implemented, records were not available for the internal audit. So the company wrote that the internal audit was not completed and that the corrective action was completed, the internal audit checklist. So identifying a few issues here, let's look at it revised. Okay, so if we have the same nonconformity statement, but if we use the 5 whys to identify the root cause, why wasn't the internal audit record available? Because the internal auditor did not have access to the required checklist. Why did they not have access to the checklist? Because the current version of the checklist was not stored on the company's share drive. And why wasn't it stored on the share drive? Because the procedure did not include completing an internal audit to the checklist from the standard owner. So correction would be complete the internal audit checklist on the correct version. And your corrective action would be update a procedure to include the internal audit directions so that the internal auditor doesn't have to guess what form to fill out when it comes to conducting the internal audit. What would you submit to the auditor? Copy of the completed internal audit, that would be your correction. And then copy of the updated Pro 1 with instructions on completing internal audit with required checklist, where the checklist retrieved and stored after completion. That would be your corrective action. So the auditors want to see the evidence of correction and corrective action. All right, case study 2. The nonconformity is on day 1 of the audit observed 3 unlabeled boxes in the freezer racks. There was no identification markings on the boxes for the product type or lot number. Root cause, lack of awareness. Corrective action. The 3 labeled boxes were discarded on the first day. Training for freezer employees documented. Will conduct warehouse training for all. So a couple problems with that. We will look at the case study number 2 revised. So same nonconformity, correction. 3 unlabeled boxes were discarded on the first day of the audit. Training for freezer employees documented. So the root cause is not, they didn't know. Let's figure out why they were putting unlabeled boxes in the freezer. Why were there unlabeled boxes in the freezer? Because the line workers forgot to label them. When did the line workers forgot to label them, or why? Sorry, because they were not completely filled and they didn't know where to put them. Why didn't they know where to put them? Because the shift supervisor was too busy to ask, and there was no work instructions at their station what to do with partial boxes. So corrective action really would be procedures were updated and work instructions were created on what to do with partial boxes at the end of the run. Work instructions were created and hung at workstations, and hold area was created in the freezer area for partial boxes. All warehouse employees were trained and updated procedures and instructions. So a lot of times when a situation is outside the normal, people make decisions if they don't have directions, and that could lead to nonconformities. Okay, our last case study, number 3, is multiple harvest workers observed to be wearing jewelry. Root cause: workers forgot to take off their jewelry. And your corrective action: specific worker trained and told not to wear jewelry in the future. So let's look at a revised case study number 3. Again, nonconformity stays the same. The correction would be: workers, take off your jewelry, don't wear them again. But what could be the possible root cause? Why did the workers forget to take off their jewelry? Because the training was not enforced. Why was the jewelry policy not enforced? Because the supervisor did not include observing for jewelry during the start of each harvest day. And why didn't the supervisor check for jewelry? Because the pre-harvest checklist template did not include this requirement. So, corrective action would be to pre-harvest checklist was updated to include observing for jewelry prior to harvest. Harvest supervisors were trained on the checklist and jewelry policy. So, like I said, sometimes training of that specific employee, even sometimes training of all the employees, makes it hard to remember. If you don't have somebody enforcing taking that jewelry off every day before starting picking, then people are more likely to wear the jewelry, and that would be a nonconformity. Okay, so I've come to the end of my presentation. I want to thank everybody for their time and happy to do any Q&As. Hey, Bella, I don't think we have any questions today that I can tell.
Nope, I haven't seen any come in. I see a hand raised. Would you mind putting your questions in the Q&A portion, and we'll be happy to let you know what our answer is. Okay, it looks like a question just came through, Lauren.
Okay, when you respond to an audit, do the actions have to be completed within 30 days or just the response? Some things could take time. So it depends on the standard itself. Most GFSI standards requiring the actions to be completed within the 30 days. So the auditor is required to leave and go over a list of nonconformities at the end of the audit, so that you know what they are and have the ability to start working on them, even if they haven't been formally reviewed and released to you. So things could take time, yes, but because there's a problem and potentially that problem could lead to unsafe food, they want the implementation of the corrective actions completed within 30 days. For example, SQF is 30 days. Things that could take a long time, such as capital improvements, which I made a note earlier, may be allowed to do a extension for, like, re-concreting the floor or sealing certain cracks, fixing, infrastructure, things like that. But things like training, procedure updates, going through some records to make sure they're corrected or whatnot, then that needs to happen within 30 days. The only standard, there's a couple standards that may allow a corrective action plan to be put into place for minor nonconformities like FSSC and GMP 455-2 GMP for dietary supplements. those do allow a corrective action plan for minors, but corrective actions to be implemented for any identified majors. Good question. Okay, any other questions?
Nothing that I'm seeing coming through.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for your time, and have a great rest of your day.